Hi guys, welcome back to my channel, Recaps and Reacts with me, Sarah. So last week I covered season 2 of Ugly Betty. This week I will be covering season 3. I actually decided to split up season 3 into 2 parts because there is just so much to cover in season 3. There are 24 episodes, about 45 minutes long, so there's a lot to go over, which is why I split it up. And spoiler alert for me, I love season 3. Season 3 is my favorite season because I think there is so much going on, and you will see as I explain it. So let's just jump right into it. So we have the guest stars that we have. We have Lindsay Lohan, Kimmy Keegan, which is Betty's high school nemesis, which I did mention last week. This is a recurring character, so she makes an appearance in this season as well. We have Regis Philbin and Kelly Ripa making cameo appearances from the Regis and Kelly show. Alexis is on the show for an episode. We have Mark Consuelos as a detective, Ralph Macchio as Councilman Archie Rodriguez, he's a recurring character throughout the season. He plays one of Hilda's boyfriends. Bernadette Peters, Jodie Papadakis, which she's a recurring character this season. She is a I guess maybe a professor of this program that Betty will be in that I will explain later on. Christina Baranski, she's Victoria Hartley. Adele playing herself. Joy Behar and Elizabeth Hasselbeck make a cameo appearance being on The View. Daniel's on an episode of The View. Billie Jean King playing as herself. Antonio Sabato Jr. playing as himself. Rachel Maddow makes a cameo appearance on her show, and Rachel Dratch, who plays Penny, who's an editor at Mode and plays her twin. Some fashion guest stars that we have that they're all playing themselves is Adriana Lima, Mark Badgley and James Mishka from Badgley Mishka, Zach Posen, Isaac Mizrahi, Nigel Barker, and Robert Verdi. So those are just a list of the guest stars that I had saw. Again, as always, please leave a comment in the comment section if I leave out anything. And also, please leave a comment in the comment section. Tell me how you like the show. If you've been watching it, tell me what you like. I want to hear about it. We can talk about it in the comment section, can start a discussion. So let's go ahead and get into these storylines because we have a lot to unpack. Okay, so last season we left off on, we didn't know if Betty chose Henry or Gio. Remember, Gio asked Betty to go to Rome with him for a month, and then Henry came back from Tucson and proposed to Betty to ask her to marry her. And then we also left off on what is going to happen with the Wilhelmina and the Meade family, because Wilhelmina told Daniel, Claire, and Alexis that she is having Bradford's baby. So we're just trying to see how all this is going to unfold this season. So the first episode basically ends up, we find out Betty actually did not choose anyone. She didn't choose Henry, nor did she choose Gio. She chose herself. She goes on a road trip, a solo road trip, and meets a bunch of inspirational women, and it inspired her. So she made a book of ideas. And some of her ideas that she has, or some goals, if you will, that she has, is she wants to take more responsibility at work so she can get a promotion. She wants no more romantic entanglements. And then her last goal is she wants to get an apartment in Manhattan. So she is striving to do those things. And this trip that she did take was about a month. So she doesn't really know what's going on at Mode right now until she goes into Mode, goes into work that day, and she sees that it's cold and dark. It's kind of black and white. There's no color. Because if you remember last season, Wilhelmina strategically pushed Daniel out of Mode magazine, and Alexis had told Daniel to take a step back. So Wilhelmina became editor-in-chief and took over Mode magazine. So it's kind of cold and dark, kind of how Wilhelmina is. And it's a little exaggerated, but it's quite funny when she shows up. Like I said, there's black and white all over Mode magazine. And so Betty had no idea that had happened. And Daniel no longer works at Mode. So she asks, where did Daniel go? And she kind of looks down. And so a few floors down, I guess, Daniel is working for another magazine, which is called Player Magazine. And if we remember from the first season, Daniel was kind of a player. He He kind of lost that facade though as he took this position at Mode. So he's kind of going back to his old ways, but he feels more comfortable at Player. So he is the editor-in-chief at Player Magazine, which is also another publication that Mead Publications owns. So just to note too that he still owns a third of Mead. So you have Alexis has a third, Daniel has a third, and Wilhelmina's unborn child has a third. Betty sees an apartment in the paper that she is interested in. Her and Christina go view it. It's a beautiful apartment. It's yellow. She says her spirit animal is there. She thinks it's Kismet. It's a sign she should have that apartment. But literally, they're having an open house at this apartment. And this lady just takes the apartment right under her nose. And she's like, wait, I was supposed to get this apartment. And the realtor was kind of like, you got to move quick. It's Manhattan. Everybody wants something in the city. So got to move fast. And she's like, well, is there anything else open? And the lady real estate agent says, yes, there's something open. I can't post it yet because technically it hasn't been, it's not vacant yet, but it will go on sale tomorrow, but I can sell it to you now. So buys it, doesn't see it, sight unseen, gets the keys the next day, comes in with Hilda. It's a dump. And Hilda's like, oh my gosh, how much money did you put into this? And Betty says she put everything into it. So she kind of has a cesspool of an apartment right now. And obviously she can't get her money back. So, oh no. Alexis, going back to Alexis and the Mead family, she ends up getting rid of Hot Flash. So I didn't explain this last season, but Hot Flash is kind of a magazine that Claire came up with after she got out of prison. She was doing her own project, so she created this magazine for Hot Flash for women her age or older. And Wilhelmina kind of convinced Alexis to get rid of Hot Flash. And again, Claire makes the statement that she made last season that you think Wilhelmina, or you're making all these decisions. However, Wilhelmina is doing all your dirty work and it's only a matter of time before she gets rid of you. So again, mama knows best. Betty comes home later on that day from work, and she's hearing noise in her apartment, and she gets like a little whistle out just in case someone's in her apartment that she doesn't know. And she walks in, and it's Hilda, Ignacio, and Justin all working on her apartment. So that was so sweet. They're trying to clean up her apartment for her, make it nice so she can live in it. And they're just being really supportive. And I thought that was just a really sweet moment from the Suarez family because they're so tight-knit, and it was just nice. Meanwhile, moving on, Willie tries to get Betty to work for her because she knows how Betty is, and she knows that Betty is trying to get Daniel back into Mode. So Wilhelmina is scheming to get Willie to work for her. Get Betty to work for her. So Betty says, Wilhelmina invites her to a lunch. They have like little luncheons, kind of like be my assistant. Betty doesn't feel comfortable because obviously her loyalty lies with Daniel. However, she is not really happy at Player Magazine. It's a lot of men. She's not comfortable. That's not her cup of tea. And Betty also, Mode's not really her cup of tea either. It's just her foot in the door. Betty is more, she wants to talk about different things, not about fashion. That's not really her thing. So Player definitely is not her thing. So Daniel finds out that Betty and Wilhelmina have a lunch together, and because Wilhelmina sees Daniel in the elevator, and she kind of mentions it in passing. Wilhelmina being Wilhelmina, she's meddling. And so Daniel confronts Betty about it. He is quite upset. And Betty says that she's not happy at Player Magazine. And he says that he is. And Betty's like, are you really? And he was like, stop it. Because, at this point, Betty and Daniel are kind of like this. They know each other so well. So Betty knows Daniel. She knows he's not really happy there. But he gets upset, and he's like, if you want to go, you can go. And she's like, do you want me to go? And he's like, whatever you want to do. And so she ends up going to work for Wilhelmina. DJ, which is Daniel Jr., Daniel's child, if you remember. So Daniel Jr.'s grandparents want custody of DJ. And but DJ wants to stay with Daniel. Back to Wilhelmina and Betty. So Wilhelmina kind of puts Betty through all these tests. She spoke up at a meeting that they had. Wilhelmina didn't too much like that. Mark told her, well, what are you doing? Don't say anything. And she's like, well, she seemed fine. And Mark is like, she was not fine. She was showing her teeth. She's like, I thought she was smiling. He was like, she was showing her teeth. So Wilhelmina calls Betty into her office, and she's just writing down, and Betty's trying to ask her questions, and Wilhelmina's just shh. And while she's writing, just don't say anything. So she gives her a list of things to do, kind of like impossible tasks for her to do, but she puts her through these rigorous tests, and Betty actually passes every single test. Mark couldn't even pass those tests. So with Betty passing all of these tests, she demotes Mark, and Betty now becomes Wilhelmina's assistant. Mark gives Betty a bag of mail that he says that Wilhelmina wanted her to shred, and Betty's kind of going through the mail and looks at some of the letters and finds that all of the letters are fan mail for Daniel, and basically how Daniel had been doing a really great job as editor-in-chief at Mode magazine. And Betty, still being, still loves Daniel, she goes downstairs, tells Daniel that, listen, you belong at Mode. And she shows him all the letters that she was supposed to shred. And Daniel's like, oh my gosh, all these are about me. And she's like, yes, see, you are really wanted. Da 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 da. And he kind of confesses that he is happier at Mode. He wants to be at Mode. That's why he got so upset with Betty, because it's a reminder that he's no longer a part of Mode, but he wants to be. However, there is a launch party for Wilhelmina, because she kind of revamped Mode a little bit, and we find out Claire, Alexis, and Daniel come back. Daniel's in a suit, nice little suit, because when he was working at Player, he was wearing these like jog suits and stuff, like some real athleisure wear. So when he comes back to Mode, he's having a suit on, and they're kind of, Claire, Alexis, and Daniel are kind of telling Wilhelmina that her revamp of Mode was the lowest selling issue because it was too cold and dark and distant, kind of how Wilhelmina is. And so because there are low sales, Daniel will become editor-in-chief again, but Alexis demotes Wilhelmina to creative director. And of course, Wilhelmina doesn't like that and proceeds to kind of threaten Alexis and Daniel that you're not going to see the last of her. And Claire is like, do not ever threaten my children. And so meanwhile, we see Christina, at the end of this particular episode, we see Christina, she's about to walk down some stairs, a flight of stairs, and then she just gets pushed by someone. We don't know who she gets pushed by, but she falls down the stairs and tumbles down the stairs, and then the scene cuts. Before the scene cuts, she's kind of laying down at the bottom of the stairs, and the scene just cuts. So we don't know who pushed Christina. Seeing how Christina is carrying Wilhelmina's baby, it is very important. So they get a detective to kind of find out what's going on. So this is getting really serious. They're trying to find out who pushed Christina. Betty ends up finding out that Alexis actually was the one who in fact pushed Christina. She does some Betty things like she does, and she finds out. She confronts Alexis about it. Alexis basically kind of says that it was not her intention. She's just so upset because she knows that Christina is carrying Wilhelmina and Bradford's baby. And honestly, I don't remember when that was actually told, but they know at this point that Christina's carrying Wilhelmina and Bradford's child. So Alexis was just irritated because all the conniving that Wilhelmina has done towards the Meade family. Alexis is upset. So she said when she saw Christina, she just kept thinking about Wilhelmina. She wasn't really seeing Christina. She just saw Wilhelmina, and she's like, I didn't really think, just pushed her. So Alexis confesses. She ends up going to jail. But before she goes to jail, she tells Claire, literally, the cops are right there about to take her down, because this is all happening at the Mode office, And so the cops are at the elevator. She hugs Claire, and she tells Claire that she saw the paternity test results for Daniel Jr., and Daniel is not the father. Alexis is the father. So, woo! What? That's crazy, because remember, all the way back to season 1, Alexis used to be Alex. So it is quite possible that Alexis is the father. It's confirmed. The paternity test said as much. So, so now Claire knows that Alexis is the father, and Alexis knows Daniel does not know any of this information yet. We cut to the next episode. Daniel visits Alexis in jail because Claire asks Daniel to visit Alexis in jail because obviously Claire knows why. Daniel doesn't really know why. So Alexis tells Daniel that she is the father to Daniel Jr. And they're kind of just sitting at the table, you know, and Daniel's just kind of sitting there and just kind of stares at her. And then all of a sudden just jumps over the table. So apparently Alexis explains that she had, when Daniel was dating Daniel Jr.'s mom, that Alexis actually slept with her as well. So Alexis, or DJ's mother, cheated on Daniel with Alexis, or Alex, excuse me, at the time. And so they slept together. So Daniel Jr. in fact is Alexis's child. So Daniel's upset about that. So Alexis has mentioned that it's important that she gave up all of her parental rights. And she was like, you know, you can still be the father, but I relinquished all my rights. So yeah. We cut to the next scene and guess who's back? Gio! So y'all remember Gio is like one of my favorite recurring characters. I love his character so much. I wish, if Betty was going to choose anyone, I wanted it to be Gio, but, you know, like I said at the beginning, she chose no one. So Gio comes back from Rome. If you remember, he went to Rome for about a month to discover his flavor and invited Betty to go, but ultimately Betty decided not to go. So when Betty's at Mode, Gio's in there, you know, doing his sandwich thing, and Betty's on the phone with Hilda at the time, and she's like, oh my gosh, Gio's back. And she's like, oh, I can't wait to talk to him, hear about his trip, can't wait to talk to him. And Hilda's kind of like, are you sure like that's going to be okay? Because is Gio okay with you? Because she might be upset. And Betty's like, no, he understood where I was coming from. And it cuts back to a scene that we didn't see last season. It didn't happen. It was the Mode versus Elle softball game. And it showed Betty telling Gio that she wasn't going to go to Rome with him. And it looked like he was pretty understanding about it. But this is from Betty's point of view, so we don't know. So then we cut back to the present scene, and Betty goes up to Gio, and she's talking to Gio. She's like, oh, hey, Gio, how's it going? She gives him this big hug, and you can tell Gio is not happy. And she's like, I want to hear all about your trip. And he says, I'm not selling you nothing. And he gives her this flyer, and it has a circle around Betty and an X over it, like a little cross line, basically being like, Betty cannot shop at Gio's sandwich shop. I forgot what it's called, but she can't shop there. She is banned. So he kind of goes in a little bit more detail as to why she's banned. So I didn't mention this last season, but Daniel basically funded the whole trip for Gio and Betty. If she was going to go, he was going to fund the trip. So Gio explains to Betty that I tried to forget you, but everywhere I went, it was under your name, Mr. Suarez. Everything was booked under Suarez. So obviously he couldn't really forget about Betty because little reminders were everywhere. And then he mentions that he saw this cheese called Donato Escamorza. So it's this, he says, I think heaven from a cow is what he calls it, Gio. And he loves this cheese, but he goes into customs to come back into the States, and they take it away from him. And he said, at that point in time, I realized, I hate you, Betty Suarez. And so he pretty much he's hurt, but he blames her for everything that had gone wrong at that point in time for that trip, everything. So he hates Betty, and she's like, oh my gosh, he really hates me. Meanwhile, DJ's grandparents end up getting temporary custody of Daniel Jr., DJ, because when Alexis gave up her parental rights, DJ's grandparents are ultimately the ones who get to take custody. They swooped in real quick, got those custody rights. So now they temporarily have custody of Daniel Jr. So Betty ends up telling Daniel about the situation with Gio and how Gio is so upset with Betty. And she mentions that there was this cheese that he really liked, Donato something. And Daniel's like, oh, Donato Escamorza. And she's like, yeah, that's it. And he's like, oh, I can get that cheese, my friend, which is a famous chef at the time. I can't remember who it was, but he's like, he has some, so I'll get it from him. And she's like, oh my gosh, can you really do that for me? So he ends up getting the cheese for Betty, and Betty he gives the cheese to Betty so Betty can give to Gio. In the meantime, because of DJ's grandparents having temporary custody, they want to come get him and taken back to France. So Betty doesn't know this, but Daniel asks Betty to take Daniel Jr. somewhere. Just he needs to like kind of think of a plan, but he asks Betty to take Daniel Jr. So Betty takes Daniel Jr. back to her apartment, and she proceeds to order a large sandwich order from Gio's Deli. And Gio doesn't know that Betty has her own apartment now, because when he did know her, she was living back at home in Queens with her family. So he delivers this order to an apartment, and then he sees B. Suarez, and he's like, crap. And he knows it's Betty. So Betty opens the door, and she's like, hi! And he said, I thought you were banned. And she says, well, no, you banned me from the shop, but not deliveries. So he comes to the apartment, and he's just like, whatever. And he tries to leave, and then she stops him, and I think he smells it, or it smells the cheese or something, but DJ kind of rips off the blanket or like the napkin that the napkin was covering the cheese. And he's like, oh my gosh, you got the cheese. And he takes it, and Betty's like, wait, that's it? And he's like, yeah. And doesn't say thank you or anything, because he's still mad at her. So Betty's like, she takes the cheese from Gio, and then she like throws it to DJ, and they're kind of playing like, you know, teasing him like he can't get the cheese until he like sits down and forgives her. So Betty forced him to listen to her trip that she had over the month, and he's like not interested, just kind of sitting there. She's going through the book, and he's just like, no. So Betty ends up telling Gio that he changed her life, because without him, she wouldn't have been able to go on this trip and push her limits, because he's always pushing her. And y'all know I said that last recap, that is why I love Gio so much, because he pushes Betty to do all of these things that she wouldn't do, and he's always rooting for her. So she does acknowledge that. Gio kind of calls out Betty. He's like, you know, you're only doing all of this to make yourself feel better. And she's like, what? He's like, yeah, you don't care about me. You're doing this to make yourself feel better, which, I mean, I don't disagree with that. I do think that she just says, no, I'm not. And he's like, you are. And he's like, you know, it takes two people to make a relationship work, and I'm not interested. And she's like, well, why not? And he says, because you broke my heart. And when he says it, his voice kind of cracks. Y'all, this is why I love Gio, because sometimes he acts so strong and tough. But also, I just like, he wears his emotions on his sleeve. So I just love that about Gio. But that kind of shuts her up for a little bit. But then Daniel ends up calling Betty, and he says, Betty, you got to get it. He says, where are y'all? Where are you and Daniel Jr.? And Betty's like, we're at my apartment. And he's like, you got to go, because DJ's grandparents are coming. And Betty's like, what is going on? And he was like, just trust me, get out of the apartment. And Gio has a van. They all get in the van. They're just driving. They end up going to Coney Island. But meanwhile, when Alexis is still in jail, so I don't know what the charge was at the time, but the district attorney ends up escalating it to attempted murder. So things are getting real serious real quick. How it got escalated to attempted murder is Wilhelmina, being Wilhelmina, she has like a little entanglement or a tryst with the district attorney, and she convinces the district attorney to up the charge to attempted murder. So this is all a part of a scheme, because Wilhelmina visits Alexis in jail and asks Alexis to give over her third of Mead Publications, so she can basically have majority of the shares. And Alexis says that she is terrified of going to prison. But she's like, I will do 100 years before I screw my brother over again, and denies Wilhelmina the share. So come on, Alexis, finally being faithful, being loyal to Daniel. So she puts her family in front of everything, and she's like, absolutely not. So of course, that's another scheme Wilhelmina has to think of, because that one fell through. So as I said, Gio, Betty, and DJ end up going to Coney Island. Daniel meets them there. Betty kind of confronts him and was like, what are we doing? Why are we here? And Daniel ends up telling them that he's not the father. And DJ overhears Daniel say that he is not the father. And Daniel does understand, Daniel Jr. understands English. And he speaks a little bit of English as well, but he understands. So he overheard that, and he just runs off. Meanwhile, back to Wilhelmina and her scheming self, Claire actually makes a deal with Wilhelmina and says that I will convince Alexis to give up her shares of Mead Publications. That way, you and Daniel will be 50-50 owners at this point. And as long as Willie gets the DA to drop the charges. And so I feel that ends up happening. Daniel and DJ end up reconciling. You know, he knows that Daniel's not DJ's father, and that's his uncle. So they end up making up. And then DJ ultimately ends up going back with the grandparents, back to France. So all is well there at Coney Island. They end up all going back home. And then Betty apologizes to Gio and for everything that had happened between them. And he ends up forgiving her. And Gio says that, again, guys, this is why I love Gio. I keep fangirling over Gio. But he tells her, he's like, you know, I've been watching you for a while now. I see you at Mode, swimming with those sharks, keeping Daniel's head above water. You know, he's like, you're going to do big things one day, and I don't blame yourself for picking you. And I was just like, y'all, get a Gio, guys. We all need a man like Gio. Just supporting. They're not even together. They're friends, but that's why I love Gio so much. Again, anyway, so yeah, they make up. All is well with Gio and Betty, so they're good. Alexis ends up going to France and Provence, and Daniel says, hey, make sure you visit DJ while you're there. And she's like, would you be okay with that? And he's like, you're his father, so sure. And she ends up going to France because she doesn't really trust Wilhelmina to put the DA back onto her. You know how Wilhelmina is. She'll pop up with another crazy scheme and do something. So Alexis is like, I'm going to just leave the country. So Alexis leaves. And at this point, Wilhelmina and Daniel are 50-50 owners of Mead Publications. So the next episode opens with Claire suggesting to Daniel and Wilhelmina that they hire a CFO because although Alexis had her faults, Alexis was really good with numbers and money. So Daniel and Wilhelmina are not. And, you know, these two are these two sole owners of Mead Publications. So a financial person comes in and says, if Mead keeps running the way it's running, it's going to be out of money in no time. So Claire suggests they hire a chief financial officer. So this is how the character Connor Owens comes into play. So she meets Connor, who's this Australian gentleman, very cute. Australian or New Zealand, I'm not really sure, but very cute. Wilhelmina, you can tell she's slightly attracted to him. And Wilhelmina also thinks that Daniel and Connor don't get along. However, Connor and Daniel are into cahoots with one another against Wilhelmina. Connor and Daniel ended up going to school. I believe they went to Harvard together, and so they already know each other. So, but they're playing this game where Wilhelmina thinks that Connor and Daniel do not get along. And then Daniel ends up mentioning that Connor is so cool, and Claire's like, be careful, Daniel, because you have a tendency to idolize people and you go in blindly and you trust them too much. So a little bit of foreshadowing there. As they go along, Wilhelmina, she's not stupid and she schemes all day, every day. And so she knows something's going on between Connor and Daniel. And she asks Daniel, like, what is going on between you two? And Daniel's like, I believe you just got played, my friend. And Wilhelmina, of course, does not like that. So she asks Smart to get some dirt on Connor. So I also just want to mention this point. This is a small point, but I want to mention it because it'll be a little important later on. But Amanda ends up moving in with Betty because in her apartment in Manhattan, because Amanda ends up running out of money. She's broke. I don't know how exactly, but Betty finds out that she's living in Mode. And she ends up moving in with Betty. So just keep that in your mind. But next thing to talk about, or the next point, Willie and Connor end up having a meeting, and Wilhelmina has a headache. And so Connor notices that Wilhelmina's having a headache, and he's like, are you okay? And she's like, it's just a headache. And she's like, I have, medicine, ibuprofen to take care of that, or just medicine to take care of that. And he says, hold on. I have something for you and it's better for your liver. So he takes her hand and he starts massaging it. And I guess probably like a pressure point or something. And Wilhelmina's kind of like a little taken aback. You can tell she's kind of like, okay. And so, he ends up massaging her hand, and he's like, having a lot of headaches. He's like, you have a lot of ideas that you can't really trust other people with, essentially. He's not saying all this verbatim, but the moral of the story is that he knows she's stressed out because she carries a lot of pressure. She can't really trust a lot of people, and it's hard having all that pressure. So I get why you have headaches, because I have a lot of headaches too. So you can see just a slight cracking of Wilhelmina's defense is cracked just ever so slightly with Connor, because you kind of realize that Connor understands her. And so you see a little bit of that. So that's happening. All right, with that scene too. So he ends up asking her like if she has some scotch or whatever, and they drink. And I'm sorry, this is all happening in her office too, by the way. So they get some scotch, have a sip, and then Wilhelmina imagines just kissing Connor. And then she snaps back to reality and realizes that was just like she's daydreaming, and then she kind of gets a little flustered and then just kind of runs out of the office. So, which you don't really ever see Wilhelmina get that way. I mean, up until this point, there have been some things, like in the first season, she had like a little bit of a tiny little romance, but that didn't really go too much, didn't really go anywhere. But this is where you're starting to see Wilhelmina kind of, again, lay down her defenses a little bit. So it's cool to see. It's nice to see. Wilhelmina and Daniel end up confronting Connor because it seems as though Connor is basically kind of playing both of them. Connor says one thing, and then he ends up doing something for Wilhelmina. Like, he'll say one thing to Daniel, but then ends up siding with Wilhelmina on something, and vice versa. He'll say something to Wilhelmina, but then it looks like he's siding with Daniel. Wilhelmina and Daniel end up confronting Connor, and Connor's like, y'all, like, I'm over it. Y'all need to figure it out. Get it together. Figure it out, basically, between the two of them, because Daniel's all upset because he sold some shares of Mode magazine or Mead publications, and Wilhelmina wanted to do that earlier on in the episode, and Connor's like, it made financial sense. I'd rather sell some of these publications off versus then tarnishing your dad's legacy completely. And then, I said earlier that Wilhelmina wanted to get dirt on Connor, and Connor's like, okay, you want dirt on me? Here it is. I did XYZ. I did this. I did that. What else do you want to know? Like, I'm tired. I will walk from both of you if we keeping this up. Wilhelmina ends up apologizing to Connor on her own because she's like, I'm sorry. I'm just not used to people who have integrity in this business. Everybody essentially is kind of shady, so it's just, I'm not used to dealing with it. And she asks Connor if they can start off on a clean slate, which he agrees to. And then just a little knife in the gut, we find out that Connor has a fiance, and that just kind of, you can tell, like, Wilhelmina's demeanor kind of changes a little bit because she likes Connor, and so now she finds out he actually is engaged, so there's that. But you know how Wilhelmina is, she wants what she wants, so of course she's going to be scheming for that. Also, this is just a small point, I want to point this out because throughout, the seasons I keep talking, or the series, I keep talking about Daniel and Betty. And Daniel and Betty have a moment where, in a particular episode, where Betty really likes this guy, and she finds out, it's not really so that he doesn't like her, but he ends up making out with a hotter chick, which is Amanda, but I'm not going to get into that because it doesn't really bring much to the story. But she's outside crying, and Daniel kind of comes outside and sees her crying, and he's like, are you okay? And she's like, of course, he said that I was beautiful, but of course I should have known that he meant on the inside. And Daniel was like, Betty, you are beautiful. Like, guys are stupid, but you are beautiful. And so you kind of see, like, again, another, like, evolution of Daniel and Betty. They're getting really close, so just wanted to point that out. That was a beautiful moment between the two of them. So Wilhelmina is trying to avoid Connor. Obviously, she can't really do that. They work together at Mode, but she comes to the office, and this is like a few days after she finds out that Connor has a fiance. So she comes to the office and she sees Connor. She tries to like avoid him, but he sees her, and he asks her if she's going to be going to the retreat, and she's kind of like, oh, I don't really care for that stuff. But he ends up ordering her to go, and if you know Wilhelmina Slater, she takes orders from no one. She kind of makes a big deal out of it. She's like, I'm your boss. And he kind of makes a dramatic production of it. And he drops down to one knee like he's proposing and takes her hand and says, will you please come to this, event? And he's like, heavy is the head that wears the crown. Excuse me, is what he says. And then she agrees, and then he kisses her hand, and he pops up and says, see you there, boss lady, or boss, or something like that. And it kind of flusters Wilhelmina, but again, she likes Connor, so it was cute to see. It was a cute little moment. Daniel, at the retreat, Daniel ends up meeting Connor's fiance, Molly. And you can kind of tell that Daniel, like, they kind of have like a little vibe going on. I believe, does she mention that I don't know if she tells him that she's Connor's fiance at the moment. She might have, I can't remember. But anyway, either way you can tell there's a little bit of a chemistry between the two. So they meet each other at the retreat. Willie is still plotting and scheming, trying to get with Connor. So she keeps making up all these little events, like work events, to distract Connor away from Molly. So she'll overhear Connor saying something like he has a anniversary dinner to go to, and then Wilhelmina thinks of, oh, we have a meeting, it's going to be a late night, which forces Connor to cancel whatever he had going on with Molly at the time. And Molly, kind of overhear Molly saying that it's always work. So apparently even probably before he got to Mode, it was a problem. Work was always getting in the way between Connor and Molly. In the next major plot line, there is Yeti, which is called Young Editors Training Initiative. So Nick Pepper, if you remember Nick Pepper, who was Alexis's assistant from the first season, he ends up, obviously Alexis has gone to France, so he ends up going into this training program, and he comes back and he's talking to the people at Mode, and he's like, yeah, I was in Yeti, now he's an editor, and he has an assistant, all these things, and Mark and Betty are just like, wow. And Betty's like, what is this? And so she ends up going to the location where Yeti has, or the Yeti office, and speaks to them and says, well, how do I get in? And the lady's like, oh, well, you just have to do XYZ. You have to make like a magazine and all these things. And then you have to present it. And Betty's like, okay, sign me up. And she's like, okay, you can do it for next year. And Betty's like, I have to do it now. And the lady's like, the deadline's just too tight. And Betty's like, but I can do it. I'm used to working on deadlines. My boss says it all the time. And she's like, oh, you are cute. So she's like, here's everything. And then she's like, well, how long do I have? And she says 2 days. So let's dial that back a little bit. So Betty has to create a whole entire magazine, 2 days, 48 hours. She has to produce a whole entire magazine. So it's Betty. So of course she tries it. She wants to do a fashion magazine because she works at Mode. Now everybody literally is kind of like, fashion? And yeah, we all know fashion is not Betty's strong suit. So everybody's kind of questioning why she wants to do fashion, or kind of like, okay, if that's what you want to do. So she ends up trying to do a fashion magazine. In the meantime, she also finds out that Mark is already in Yeti, and she finds out Mark's in Yeti, and she gets excited, and she's like, oh my gosh, be grateful getting it together. And Mark's like, no, that's where you're wrong, because Yeti only takes one person from one magazine. Mark and Betty are essentially competing against one another, and Betty ends up doing a magazine that is true to her. So she ends up not doing a fashion magazine, but does something that, that she wants to do. Connor asks Daniel to speak to Molly's class. He has to do a work situation, has a work meeting, so he asks Daniel to fill in for him instead and speak to Molly's class. I think she has kindergartners or first graders, one of the two. But Betty also asked Daniel to look at her letter from the editor before she has to present her project to Yeti. And Daniel says, he's like, yeah, I should be back in an hour or so. I'm just going to go talk to Molly's class real quick. Of course, he ends up taking longer and misses the whole thing, or doesn't get to look at Betty's letter from the editor, and Betty has to present her project at Yeti. So Betty actually ends up getting into Yeti, and which means that Mark did not get in. So Betty goes to go talk to Mark and says, I'm sorry you didn't get in. And Mark says, there is no way that your project was better than mine. And she's like, maybe they just, mine had more, they liked mine more, and da-da-da-da. And Mark is like, I have been doing this forever. I have been working for an assistant for 4 years who doesn't even know that I got or am trying to do anything with this program. I studied fashion. I went to FIT. I went and had an internship at some fashion house in overseas. I don't know if it was France or Italy, but he's like, I have worked hard. You ultimately have not done anything. He's like, you got in to Yeti because you are Latina, in so many words. He doesn't come out and just flat out say that, but beats around the bush and then finally says it. And Betty takes offense, and she gets upset with him and tells him that's probably the ugliest thing that he's ever said to her. And he's like, well, it's true. So we don't get to see Mark's presentation at Yeti, but going back, when you watch the episode, because you should watch the episode, Mark's project, flawless probably compared to Betty's, because Betty's literally was done overnight and Mark had 3 months to work on that project. So his project looked stunning. And he also had Mark Badgley and James Mishka backing him up as well at his presentation. So we probably know that what Mark has said is probably true. And so Poppy and Hilda come to Mode to celebrate Betty getting into Yeti, and Betty kind of tells them everything, what happened between her and Mark. And Poppy says, it sounds like sour grapes. And she said, well, I called Yeti. They didn't exactly deny it. And Hilda says, who cares? Get in where you can, girl, essentially. And listen, as a minority, anytime if minorities, like if you get something for your skin tone, your ethnicity, it doesn't matter. Sometimes it just matters like what you do with it once you get in there. An opportunity is an opportunity. And if that is the way, if that's what they want to do, it's what you do once you get into whatever you get into. So it's how you show them that you deserve to be there. So just know that. But anyway, back to the show. Hilda and Poppy are essentially kind of saying the same thing. They're just like, an opportunity is an opportunity. It is what it is. But Betty being Betty, she gives her slot to Mark, and Mark takes it. And Wilhelmina also finds out that Mark gets into Yeti, and she congratulates him and says she can't think of anyone more deserving. So remember, Mark said that he thought that Wilhelmina didn't even know he went for that he was trying to get into that program, but she did know, and she congratulated him. So that's a little small thing between Mark and Wilhelmina. You can tell that she actually does care about Mark. So that was cute. And if you remember, Betty had asked Daniel to look at the letter from the editor in her project, and he missed it because he was at Molly's class. He stayed a little too long being at Molly's class, and so he didn't get to read Betty's letter from the editor. So Betty's upset with Daniel, but he actually solves that because he found out that Betty gave her spot to Mark at Yeti. So he called Yeti and convinced them to let Betty in because she also worked for Player Magazine. So he really played that up. So he told them she worked at Player Magazine. And if you remember, Yeti does not hire people from the same but they don't let two people in from the same magazine. So with Daniel kind of said that Betty worked at Player, Mark works at Mode, so they're not from the same magazine. And then he also wrote a 6-page letter of recommendation for Betty as well. So Betty ends up getting into Yeti. Woo! So Mark and Betty are both in Yeti. So yay! Daniel receives thank you letters from Molly's class, and then Daniel calls Molly and thanks her for that. So that's a really small point, but it's another sweet moment between Molly and Daniel. You can tell they kind of like each other. Connor and Wilhelmina are in Florida at this work event because remember I said Wilhelmina's plotting and scheming, and so they end up going on a work trip together. Wilhelmina tries to kind of make a move on Connor, and Connor says, you need to stop. I am engaged. You must stop. You have to stop this. So, you know, I'm starting to think with the reason why Wilhelmina is so, like, I think smitten with Connor and why he's also good for her because he's very direct. They're kind of one and the same. And she does mention that Connor is a lot like her. And so Connor is very direct with her. There's some authority with him. And I think Wilhelmina is a very strong woman. So she likes that. So with that being said, he tells her to, you know, stop it. Wilhelmina again is trying to avoid Connor at all costs in mode. Anytime she sees him or she tries to avoid him. Obviously that will only work for so long because they work in the same building, same office. Molly asks Daniel to come to a charity auction because he had such a good time coming to her class. Connor couldn't show up, so she asked if Daniel will take her place, and Daniel agrees to do that. And Molly had came into the office to ask her that, to ask him that. And Claire, when Molly is leaving, Claire kind of sees that. And Claire being Claire, Mama Bear, she's kind of like, that's a little interesting. So Claire confronts Daniel and asks, why was Molly here? And he tells her, and Claire kind of like, she says that, oh, it seems like she likes you. And he's like, no. And he's like, she says, do you like her? And I think he admits that he likes her, and then she slaps him. And he's like, what are you doing? And she's like, stop it. Do not. Connor is your friend, and he is CFO of this company. Do not get entangled with his fiance. I know a thing or two about fidelity. Now, I do want to point out right here, of course, we know about Faye and Bradford. However, the way Claire says it, perhaps there's a little bit of foreshadowing with that statement that she knows a thing or two about fidelity. So, again, just keep that in your mind. But Claire tells Daniel basically to stay away because Molly is engaged. So, just back up. Just write her a check. Do not go to that event. Just write a check for it. And so that's ultimately what Daniel ends up doing. Daniel writes Molly a check instead of going to the charity event with her. And she comes by, stops by the office. And he's eating like some sweet and sour sauce. And she like reaches for it. She's like, oh, can I have some? Or maybe it was orange chicken. It was a Chinese food. And she's wearing this white dress. And he's like, you think you want to get like a fork or something? And she's like, no, I'm really great with chopsticks. And she gets the chopsticks and the piece of meat falls and gets on her dress. And luckily, you know, Daniel works at a fashion magazine. So he's like, listen, we'll get you a dress. So he brings her to the closet. She picks out a dress. She changes. She looks beautiful. Daniel's kind of like at a loss for words. And they almost kiss. They get a little too close and they almost kiss, but they don't actually kiss. And then Molly kind of runs off. Somehow Mark ends up getting the security tape. I don't know why. I don't know. Wilhelmina asked for the security tape. For what reason, I don't know. I don't know if she's always been doing that, but she gets the security tape and they play it. Wilhelmina sees that Daniel almost kisses Molly and she's like, oh, this is something. Okay, I can use this because again, Wilhelmina wants Connor, so she's like, oh, Daniel looks like she's interested. Or excuse me, he's interested in Molly. And so, of course, Wilhelmina, being Wilhelmina, she's going to use that to her advantage. So Willie brings up the video to Daniel, and Daniel's like, you were an awful person. And she says, here, she gives him the tape, or it's actually a DVD. So she gives him the DVD, and she's like, this is the only copy. Here you go. And Daniel actually confides in Wilhelmina, and it's kind of like, you know, I like her, but I don't know if she likes me. I don't know. There's some feelings there. It's not love, but there are some feelings there. And Wilhelmina's like, you should go for it. And so, yeah. So Daniel and Wilhelmina kind of have this thing. Like, so now Daniel is confiding in Wilhelmina about Molly. It's a little weird, but I mean, it's a thing. I mean, obviously Wilhelmina has a motive, but I don't think Daniel knows that. Betty and Mark start Yeti. So they go there. Bernadette Peters, Jodie Papadakis is actually the instructor for Yeti. So she is asking them, like, she's doing roll call, and then she asks Mark St. James. He says, I'm here. And then she says, name 5 people in this classroom, what magazine they're from. So he names off 5 people. She calls on Betty and asks her to do the same thing. Betty cannot say 5 people in that room because she did not go to the mixer the night before. And Jody confronts her about that, and she says, well, I had like a family event. And Jody says, okay. She makes an announcement and says, there is a mixer tonight or the next night, whichever. She's like, next class, you need to have 40 contacts by next class. She's like, you're going to have to make a lot of sacrifices in this business. And so you need to find 40 contacts, and your family is not one of them. So that's kind of throwing some shade to Betty. So basically, she's kind of telling Betty, you need to get it together if you want to be in this industry, because you're going to have to make sacrifices, and that means sometimes missing out on some family things. Oh, and if she doesn't get the 40 contacts, she says, don't bother coming back to this program. So, yikes. So Willie suggests that Daniel confesses his feelings to Molly at one of her parties. She's having a party later on that week, and she tells Daniel that this would be a great opportunity for Daniel to talk to Molly. And so Willoughby is having this kind of like grand party, kind of almost like a networking party. And I almost want to say that she's literally having this party so Daniel can confess his feelings to Molly. That way she can swoop in on Connor, because, you know, once Daniel actually confesses her feelings to Molly, then, or confesses feelings to Molly, then Connor will be alone. And that means Connor is fair game. So, in the meantime, Hilda is having a work event. So I don't really talk about this too much because it's not really a major plot line, but Hilda ends up opening a salon at the Suarez house. And so she's having a grand opening, and she needs all hands on deck. She needs her family to help her. That includes Betty, but Betty's kind of caught up in her own world with Yeti, and, you know, she just got ripped a new one by Jody, basically being like, get it together. You don't need to be in this industry. And so she's really focused on work. So she's kind of dropping the ball with helping Hilda with her thing. And she's getting a lot of grief from Ignacio and Hilda, because she's like, listen, the event that Hilda's having is very important to Hilda. She's always there for you. You need to in turn be there for for Hilda. So Betty's having a hard time because she also really wants to do this Yeti thing. She's networking. She's trying to move up in her career. And then she has her family here on the other side. So she's supposed to help Hilda set up for this event, but she has this work thing that she has to do, so she can't help Hilda set up for the event. But she ends up coming to the event for Hilda, but she gets called away from a work emergency. And then Hilda's like, oh my gosh, are you leaving early? And she's like, yes, Hilda. She's like, I'm so sorry, but it's something really important. And she's like, well, this is important for me. And she gets upset. And then Poppy comes in, and Betty's like, will you talk to her, please? And Poppy says, no, Hilda's right. Like, honey, this is her event. You need to stay here. And she's like, I'm sorry, I have my career. I can't do this. And she's like, hopefully one day y'all will understand, but I can't stay here. And she goes off to her work emergency. So the party, Wilhelmina's party, ends up happening. And Daniel's able to confess his feelings for Molly. They kind of talk. He's like, I can't stop thinking about you. Molly gets uncomfortable, and she's like, we can't do this. While Daniel's in confessing his feelings for Molly, Wilhelmina in turn is trying to do the same for Connor, but they end up getting interrupted because Molly kind of storms out after talking to Daniel. She does not reciprocate the feelings to Daniel, but she ends up storming out from Daniel, and then telling Connor she wants to go home. So Wilhelmina doesn't really get to tell her how she feels about him. And so they end up leaving early from the event, from Wilhelmina's party. Wilhelmina asks Daniel, I take everything didn't go the way you wanted it to. And Daniel says, no, but it also looks like it didn't work out for you either. And Wilhelmina's like, what do you mean? And Daniel's like, listen, I knew once you didn't have a professional reason, there was more of a reason why you were pushing me and Molly to be together, essentially. So, and she's like, I'm also seeing the way you look at him. So Daniel knew that Wilhelmina had the hots for Connor this whole entire time. So Daniel's not stupid. So he knew that what Wilhelmina's motive was to push Molly and him together. Betty and Mark end up going to Wilhelmina's party because they saved the day. I'm not really going to get into it because it's not really a major plot point, but that work emergency that I had mentioned earlier, why, Betty left for Hilda's event, was because of this work emergency, they end up saving the day. And so Mark and Betty go to Wilhelmina's house, and Wilhelmina just invites them to the party. And so ultimately it's a work event, a networking event for Betty. And actually Jody is at that event too as well. And so Betty does ask Jody at that party if she can be her mentor. And Jody's just kind of like, let's just see how, the rest of Yeti goes, and we'll go from there. So Mark and Betty are like, oh my gosh, like doors are really starting to open up for us because, at this event that Wilhelmina is having, there's a lot of people in the magazine industry, the publishing industry at this event. So they're kind of moving up in the world. So she ends up going home, and because she did get a phone call, while she was at the party, she got a phone call, but then she ended up putting it on silent mode. And she ends up going home back to Queens, and she walks into the door and nobody's there at the party. Like, the party's over and nothing's there. The house looks like it was broken into. And so Betty picks up her phone and she sees that she has several missed calls from Hilda. So she calls Hilda and she's like, where are y'all? And she's like, we're at the hospital. Hilda says, we're at the hospital. And Betty's thinking that Christina had her baby. And she's like, Christina had her baby? And she's like, no, it's Poppy. He had a heart attack. So, oh, man. So it cuts to Daniel, it cuts to the next scene. Daniel's walking home. And while he's walking, as soon as he walks home, he sees Molly on his stoop. And Molly says that she has feelings for him too, and that she broke up with Connor. And then she kisses Daniel. And then it cuts to Wilhelmina's apartment. She's just kind of sitting on her couch after her party, and she hears a knock on the door. And then it's Connor at the door, just kind of like leaning against the door jamb, just like breathing heavy, like he just ran there. And no dialogue is exchanged. She just comes in and kisses Wilhelmina, and I think shuts the door. And then it cuts to Betty going to the hospital, and Poppy's in the hospital bed. Justin and Hilda's holding Justin. They're both crying, and Betty's crying, and Poppy's unconscious, and that's how that scene ends. And this is where I'm actually going to stop right here. I'm going to leave it on a cliffhanger. I think that was the end of episode 11. So I mentioned there are 24 episodes in this season, and that just stopped at episode 11. That's why I broke this season up, because there is just so much to get into. And if I were to sit here and do all of season 3 right now, I would be on this camera for 5 hours, and nobody wants a 5-hour video. So anyway, so that's the middle of season 3. We're leaving off of Poppy's in bed at the hospital unconscious. We don't know what's going to happen with Poppy. Apparently Wilhelmina and Connor got together, Molly and Daniel got together, but how is all that going to work? Because Connor doesn't know that Daniel and Molly have a thing going on. And remember, Connor and Daniel are friends. So, woo! Uh-oh. And Connor is CFO for this company. Yikes. So we got business and pleasure, me and Mix all over. Wilhelmina's Connor's boss. It's just a mess, y'all. So, yeah. So leave a comment in the comment section. Tell me what you think about Ugly Betty thus far. So far, if you watched, I hope y'all are watching them. Please watch this show, because I'm only talking about the major plot lines. There are still little storylines, little sub-storylines, subplots that I'm not talking about because it's just too much to talk about. But please come back next week. I'm going to cover part 2 of season 3. Thank you so much for stopping by and watching this video. If you got all the way to the end, thank you. I know these are long videos and I'm trying hard. My family has been telling me that these are too long, but it's hard. It's fitting 24 episodes into one, like a 45-minute session it's hard. So trying to cover all the bases. I want you all to watch the show if you haven't watched the show, or if you have already watched Ugly Betty and love Ugly Betty like myself, and you just like to hear about it and talk about it, please, I am here. So anyway, like I said, next week we'll talk about part 2 of season 3. Please, again, like and subscribe. Thank you for stopping by, and I will see you all next week. Bye.